Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here joining us this evening for the first in our professorial lecture series to honour and celebrate the outstanding achievements of the academics here at the College of Asia and the Pacific. I've wanted to do this since I became Dean, that we take the time to honour the colleagues who get promoted to level E to become professor, because I think not only is it important to really celebrate what they've achieved, but it also gives them an opportunity to talk to us about what they're thinking about, what they're working on, and it gives all of us an opportunity to think about what we might do now in the future, and how we can learn from the terrific experience and expertise that they possess. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge that the land on which we meet, live and work is land that has never been ceded. So tonight, the first of these lectures, we are gathered to honour and recognise Professor Roald Maliankai's contributions to research and teaching in the college. Now, some of you will know that Roald specialises in cultural industries, heritage preservation, performance and fandom from the early 20th century to the present. That all sounds, well, interesting, but a bit dry. So I asked Roald earlier today to just give us a bit of a backstory on, okay, so what brought you here? How did you end up as a professor in this university focusing on the things that you're focusing on? And he very generously shared his CV, which has some very interesting things in it, and also some thoughts and reflections that I just want to share with you. But before I get to that, one of the things we also want to do is not only hear from Roald and what he's working on, what he's thinking about, but to also have the opportunity to get some immediate expert reflections on the lecture that Roald will be given. And so on this particular occasion, I'm very pleased that one of Roald's colleagues, the director of the ANU Career Institute, Professor Kyung Huang, has agreed to reflect on what Roald will be talking about. So thank you for joining us. But before we hand the floor over to Roald, as I said, his CV is quite fascinating. I mean, here is somebody who's travelled from Europe, who studied at Amsterdam, or worked at Amsterdam, studied at Leiden, studied at SOAS in London. Has quite the CV, including, it says right at the bottom of his CV, a diploma A to C in violin, which I think speaks volumes of somebody who is so credentialed that they still find space in their CV to note that. Was that your first major achievement? Thought so. And as I say, I asked Roald to share with us, well, what is it that led you here and led you to this project? He's written extensively on a wide variety of things to do with career and culture and music. So why this project? Why now? And I just want to read you some words that he's shared. I think, he says, what has led me to this point today is being fascinated by the culture of everyday life in East Asia. My father, who was half Chinese, half Indonesian, had a great interest in Chinese culture. At some point, he created a radio series on the history of Chinese immigrants in the Netherlands, and he often took me along. So, inspired by the stories and the awesome food we had each time he met his informants in a Chinese restaurant in the harbour of Rotterdam, I chose to study literary Chinese, Japanese, and Korean as my major at Leiden University. And this is the key. The reason I focused on Korean rather than Chinese is that the professor had a really cool hairstyle and a great passion for the mundane. So from such chance encounters, careers are born. And in terms of this particular interest, which I know Roald talked about at his interview for the chair last year. He says, shortly after moving from Amsterdam to ANU, I became acquainted with a watchmaker in Europe. And for some time, I ended up helping him establish his fast-growing brand, Social Media, simply as a hobby. I had an interest in watches since I was a teenager, so it felt very special to be able to eventually visit his studio to learn about the intricacies of the business from an entrepreneur's perspective and to hear about all kinds of developments firsthand. It is this experience that encouraged me also to explore the culture of timekeeping in Korea. So, and then he goes on to say, please feel free to make up much more interesting stuff, like he holds a pet gorilla in his granny flat. But we won't go into that. We will stick with timekeeping in Korea. And Roald, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you all for being here today. It's quite something. And I've been stressed all day, so I'm kind of look forward to the end of it, quite frankly. I'm really grateful to all of you for coming on a very dark and cold Wednesday evening. But without further ado, let me get to this, because one of the things I talk about is time management, and I think we all want to get to those drinks anyway. So, the phrase "빨리 빨리," hurry hurry, is frequently used, sometimes jokingly, to refer to the Korean approach to business, as it characterizes how results are achieved regardless of magnitude or risk. It is also applied critically. Initially promoted in the 60s and 70s under Park Chung-hee's military administration, it's become a common phrase in South Korean organizational life. The phrase gave rise to another business motto, 하면 된다, just do it. This translation is a bit awful. Which in 1983 inspired Ssangyong Motor, originally specialized in the assembly of military vehicles, to rebrand its compact SUV range as Korando, a contraction of Korea Can Do. Park adopted the moral values that were fundamental to the success of his developmental state during his years of service in the Japanese Imperial Army in Manchukuo. Indeed, according to sociologist Han Sak-jung, Park's approach towards economic and technological development in the 60s is comparable to that which the Japanese applied in Manchukuo in the 1930s. But in Korea, at least, the notions of punctuality and timeliness, so crucial to the conception of this approach, were ushered in earlier, around the late 19th century. But before I take you back to that fin de siècle, it's worth noting that the Japanese Empire's management of time would affect North Korea too. On May the 5th, 2018, the 117th year of Juche, North Korea moved its clocks forward by 30 minutes to align them with those of its southern neighbor. The adjustment followed positive diplomatic developments, including a meeting between Presidents Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in a week earlier, and the promise of a summit between North Korea's Kim and US President Donald Trump, which would take place in the weeks after. Because China follows a single time zone across its vast territory, 8 hours ahead of GMT, the move did not bring the Korean peninsula in alignment with the time zone of the Dongbei region in the north, but instead positioned it in the subsequent meridian alongside its former colonizer, Japan. Yet again. Some 3 years prior, on August the 15th, 2015, on the day it celebrated the 70th anniversary of the historic day on which the great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung, overcame bloody battles with the Japanese, defeated the thieving Japanese Empire, and liberated our nation, North Korea had chosen to return to what it called Pyongyang Standard Time. By moving its clock back half an hour, it returned to the time zone it occupied prior to 1912, when Korea was made to follow that of its colonizer, and to which South Korea had also briefly returned between 1954 and 1961. Now, despite this being a very understandable decision and perhaps also a way of making better use of daylight, some conservative Korean and Western media portrayed the move as a new attempt at derailing normalization efforts and inter-Korean exchanges. A snub of both Japan and Korea, one that recklessly placed political concerns before improving the lives of its citizens. I dare you to say that to the government of South Australia. Anyway, rather than by the position of the sun, GMT differentials have often been determined by either political or religious affiliations or both. The adoption of universal time, which took place in the late 19th century, arguably the heydays of Western imperialism, allowed colonial powers to implement time zones that promised operational efficiency and increased profit margins. Post-colonial efforts to undo their legacy have repeatedly rearranged the global tapestry of time zones. They form part of a process that will likely never reach a conclusion, of which North Korea's recent move is just one example. Another is a conference in Qatar in 2008, where scholars advocated for the replacement of GMT, which was introduced by their former colonizer, with something called Mecca Mean Time. Apart from these efforts to free oneself from the shackles of colonialism, time zones have also been determined by the nature of bilateral relationships and the image of independence. In 2014, for example, when Crimea voted to join Russia, the region moved its clock 2 hours forward to join Moscow's time zone. And today, I understand that many Uyghur citizens defiantly observe a time that is 2 hours behind that of Beijing, based on the relative distance of their region, Xinjiang, from Greenwich. Operating across regional borders, whether in person or virtually, may require much more than accounting for different time zones. Even within a single nation or across seemingly similar cultures, there may be different public holidays, calendars, and standards of timekeeping to observe. As they're often deeply rooted in religion or the prevailing social order or both, key dates, rites, and celebrations are important ontological symbols that define the identity of both individuals and communities. Those of elevated social standing would often seek to confirm the veracity of such symbols through accounts that defied easy denial. In pre-modern China, for example, timekeeping allowed the imperial palace to demonstrate its place under heaven, while time-telling was that which took place mostly outside of the palace, to remind the common folk of the timetable for key events. To understand time itself was thus a privilege held by those in power. Takashi Fujitani argues that in Japan, where it is accepted that commoners were all but unaware of the emperor during the Tokugawa period, in the subsequent eras, the natural course of events, the political status quo, and even Japanese culture all came to be explained with reference to that very emperor. While key events and their foundations can therefore be manipulated, once they've become part of a culture or a political order, efforts to change them may be met with fierce resistance. Indeed, when colonizing new territories, empires had to weigh up the risk of upsetting locals and provoking unrest with their systems of time management, even where their early introduction seemed administratively possible. In British India, for example, the very notion of the new time system being superimposed by the colonizer risked inviting opposition. And yet the introduction of a mean time by colonial powers was rarely a simple top-down process. It was frequently driven by scientific associations or local businesses running international operations. Korea was no exception. Although the Japanese government made the peninsula follow Japanese Standard Time from January the 1st, 1912, 2 years after it was annexed. The move was just one in a line of changes to the official systems of time management, many of which were initiated by Koreans. Possibly because the new systems did not immediately replace other ones, or because they regarded them as part of globalization and inexorable technological innovations, the solar calendar and 12-hour clock time, for example, were introduced without any public opposition. Indeed, at least since 1884, 12 years before it was officially introduced, the solar calendar was used in some parts of the country to facilitate trade with Japanese companies. And even after it was promulgated in 1896, the lunar calendar remained in semi-official use. Railroads and post offices, meanwhile, used a standard time that was 30 minutes ahead of Japanese standard time, one that the Korean government would then briefly endorse for roughly 4 years in 1908. Among those openly welcoming the new timekeeping systems were, of course, the colonizers themselves. Like other colonial powers and Christian missionaries, the Japanese justified colonization through their mission to modernize and upgrade their new territories and to provide locals portrayed as lacking in diligence and an interest in progress, with the tools and know-how to do so. Introducing modern administration and the industries that would depend on punctuality and the appeal of modern timekeeping, they were part of measures taken to reorganize and upgrade the colony's administration, as well as the infrastructure and the public and corporate sectors. While they were intended primarily to improve productivity, they also served, of course, to foster assimilation and compliance. And here, I guess, Daniel Hedrick's The Tentacles of Progress, the technology transfer in the age of imperialism is of use. It's a study that demonstrates that certain technologies remained firmly in the hands of colonizers, and I think it applies to this study too. It's relevant. For example, to the technologies used in mining and in factories, as well as to the repair and manufacture of clocks and watches, which the Japanese would eventually monopolize, at least on the peninsula. The lasting impact of modern timekeeping standards on the daily lives and aspirations of Koreans yield crucial perspectives regarding the experience of colonialism, urbanization, and industrialization. By analyzing the introduction and implementation of these managements in colonial Korea, I'm driven by the following questions. What role did the colonial government play in the adoption of the new systems and the notion of punctuality on the Korean peninsula? Which aspects of the inherent changes did the Koreans resist and why? And what was the impact of the new systems on the business sector? In seeking to answer these questions, I eschew attempts to capture the complex notions of time held by individuals or minority groups, and I aim my visor instead at the practical implications to the kind of majority. When exploring the notion of time in Korea at the end of the 19th century, one will struggle to avoid the frequent mention of Koreans' tardiness in Japanese sources. As Korea was to become part of a modern empire that was driving innovation, there was no place for the inefficiencies of old. And yet the natives, they often reported, lacked a sense of purpose, diligence, and an interest in progress. As the Japanese politician Ozaki Saburo put it back in 1896, it was out of sheer kindness that Japan tried to improve this country. And in 1899, a report in the Eastern Economic Report read, by and large, when people look at Korea, they think of it as an infirm and weak country whose sources of wealth have already all been exploited. But in fact, it is rich in minerals and cereals and other natural resources. The only reason whereby Korean industry is today not greatly flourishing is largely that the Korean people are weak and lazy and lacking the spirit of enterprise. Also, transport facilities are inefficient. The Japanese, so it would seem, were here to both help these poor natives and exploit their peninsula, as though it was inevitable that someone would, so it might as well be them. In his Offspring of Empire, historian Kader Ecker writes, although the Japanese were fond of characterizing the Korean worker as unambitious, physically and intellectually lazy, and irresponsible, they were also quick to point out that Korean labor was abundant and cheap. The Japanese government portrayed itself as a driver of prosperity, and to justify its measures, it depicted its subjects as having suffered from ineffective governance and lacking a proper sense of time. That was so vital to the productivity and order required for their positive transformation. A few early foreign visitors to Korea arrived at that very same conclusion, presumably based on experience, though they are likely to have seriously exaggerated their accounts for religious, commercial, or other reasons. In 1908, for example, Horace Allen wrote, "The whole people may be considered as children. So childlike are they in many ways, with few amusements and until recently no newspapers, with plenty of leisure and the habit of not doing today that which may be put off till tomorrow." Roughly a decade and a half later, writer-explorer Isabella Bird Bishop and geographer Alan Churchill Semple arrived at very similar conclusions. Christian publications, of course, welcomed reports like these, since they justified efforts to liberate the Koreans from the aimlessness and disorder of their pre-converted past. It is no wonder, therefore, that their representatives' report make claims that echo those of the Japanese authorities. In the 1885 issue of the American Methodist journal, The Gospel in All Lands, Koreans are described as you can see, exceedingly lazy and dirty, who would not work if they can help it, and gave foreigners a hard time by not finishing their jobs. And in 1907, in front of an audience of Presbyterian churchgoers, a certain Professor Harry Torrey of the University of California described the Koreans as dignified, lazy dogs. Predictably, in a report in the Chinese Recorder and Missionary Journal of March the 1st, 1910, conversion to Christianity promised to resolve the less than ambitious mindset of Koreans. Because, it says, of the oppression for centuries, the Korean is often lazy and shiftless, but he is marvelously transformed when he becomes a Christian. The Japanese knew also that depicting colonial subjects as naturally lazy could ricochet. So soon after annexation, foreign language propaganda began boasting of Japanese successes in raising productivity in Korea. And so in 1911, the Japan Times cited a Professor Johannes Boljan of the Foreign Language School in Seoul as saying, "The Koreans used to be a lazy, shiftless lot, but they have been entirely reconstructed." It is important, however, not to rely only on accounts like these that fit a particular model, and to also look beyond that which supports any colonial or indeed evangelical perspective. Shin Seung-yap notes that schools established by Western missionaries became important vehicles for the dissemination of time as an articulated unit and standard of conduct. Indeed, from the late 1890s onwards, Korean school books began introducing Western clocks, as you can see here, weekdays, the importance of punctuality, that's punctuality right there, and new national holidays. Among the latter were the birthday of Emperor Meiji, of course, and New Year's Day according to the solar calendar, as well as eventually May 1st as Children's Day, Time Day, and from 1939 onwards, April 7th as Horse-Loving Day. So I think Dutch butchers actually had a horse-loving day, but that had an entirely different meaning. The experience of the new timekeeping systems differed for men and women. In Japan and Korea, so-called modern girls may have appeared to embrace the liberation of women that modernity promised, including its new timekeeping standards, but unlike in Japan, in Korea, work opportunities for women remained scarce, forcing the majority to become housewives upon marriage. Their relegation to domesticity did not, however, entail a reprieve from pressure to be punctual, as intellectuals deemed it essential to successful household management. Schools and print media promoted the ideal of a wise mother and good wife. By educating women about the virtues of modernity and the value of domesticity, it was implied that they were to pursue Western fads merely as a pastime, rather than an ideal. Women, in other words, were ultimately meant to preserve traditional values, but to use modern methods and technology to allow their family to thrive. A series of articles entitled How to Improve the Household, 가정은 어떻게 개선할까, which ran across several issues of 동명, in October 1922, explained how housewives should divvy up their day, as you can see here. Meanwhile, Korean workers, factory workers, the majority of whom were female, had to work for more than 12 hours a day, which was a few hours more than their Japanese counterparts. And in the textile industry, at least, Korean women also tended to work longer hours than their kind of male counterparts, Korean men, who were also permitted, really unfairly, to use the short morning and afternoon breaks to move away from their workstation to light up a cigarette. Not fair. As in Japan and Europe decades earlier, the railway system, postal services, and telegraph communication also played a major role in ushering in the adoption of a nationwide timetable and the importance of punctuality. In the late 1890s, periodicals began to include timetables, for example, for travelers, for tourists. But rail travel was a luxury. It was exclusive to a minority of the population, and yet, even though we were dealing with the elite, in order for the service to run punctually, passengers needed to board on time regardless of their social class. As you can see at the bottom here, someone enjoyed this scene where this Yangban showed up and told his minions, "Make that thing stop before I get on." And of course, it didn't. Rail travel was crucial to the tourism industry, which was driven in part by the appeal of being able to take time off. It may therefore seem ironic, perhaps, that just like pocket watch manufacturers did in the West, in Korea, ads for watch manufacturers associated the products with the accuracy that punctual railroad operation required. What is interesting about these two ads is that on the one hand here, and this is something that Haratunian has also discussed in relation to Japan, but that they're trying to make people see a watch as part of a cultured life. That's the characters there. And on the right, you can see that the pressure is also on parents to buy their kid, probably male, a watch because it makes them more successful at being students. So the ad says, student watch. The business of watches and clocks was huge, and so they had their own buildings, these big companies, in the very center of Seoul. They've all since disappeared, but as you can see in these old photos, they really were quite formidable. Now, as part of its efforts to promote punctuality, from 1921 onwards, the Government General mobilized student and wives organizations on the 10th of June, and here this is from a newspaper on the 11th, to celebrate so-called Time Day, so 시의 기념일, as it brought together these organizations for all kinds of events, and the newspapers were really full of all kinds of events taking place on that day, the 10th. newspapers reminded people of why they were doing this. So it was to celebrate the introduction of a water clock by Emperor Tenji on that day in 671, but at the same time, of course, it was really trying to make people aware that being a punctual person was being a productive person, and therefore a good citizen. This is a photo from somewhere in Japan, I'm not really sure where, and this is the same, so in a sense, the same celebration, and so you can find very similar scenes, but much worse photos, that's why I chose this, from Korea as well, on that same day. And what is interesting here, perhaps, as well, is that Mazda was, before it became a car company, was kind of an electric clock company, and I drive a Mazda, and my clock is shit. Anyway, they used to be very special. So what they did was they offered free services to anyone with a watch or a clock on that particular day, and of course that would generate loyalty among customers, and all the watch stores in the main cities in Japan and Korea participated. And so in Seoul, you can find on the 10th of June, you can find, well, actually the 11th, the next day, you can find a lot of photos of people lining up to get a free service for their clock or watch, tiny clocks. And this is, this is a great opportunity, of course, for watch makers to advertise their product. Soon, however, criticism arose of the excessive consumption of watches and other accessories by so-called modern girls. Such criticism was likely fueled by misogyny and the overt display of wealth or the radical adoption of Western fashion, particularly by Kiseng, the young professional female entertainers and courtesans, and the negative impact that they had on the prestige of those products. In February 28, as you can see here, a cartoon depicted a line of identical-looking women on a tram holding the commuter strap with their right arms each proudly showing off their watch and their ring. The watch craze was all driven by women's blind conformity, so it was suggested. Like most stores, Korean watch and clock retailers had no set closing times, allowing the first break of dawn to set the start of a day that would end with darkness and the consistent absence of passers-by. The Hwaxin department store was no different, and store workers had to work such long hours that they sometimes went to have a quick nap in a wardrobe in the furniture section. A newspaper report from October 1938 said that female workers at the department store would leave home at 9 and come home at 10:30. So very long days. Work pressure, though, when you try to find evidence of all this, was not dictated only by specified working hours, as you can imagine. Despite those working hours being the subject of much debate and legislation, as you can find in archival materials. Corporate culture played a very considerable role, as did in the early 1930s the continued implementation of an arbitrary system of fines that appears to have been merely used to justify paying less to workers. Surprise, surprise. A somewhat cynical editorial in July 1930 in Byeolgangon that explained to graduates that for them to be successful, they really had to get up earlier than they should. And when the time had come for them to leave for home, they ought not to just put on their hat and head out the door, but wait for the executive to leave first. It sounds very much like July 2023 in Korea, to be honest. Conformity nevertheless promised success, and to ensure continued success, in the late 30s, Japanese companies introduced the punch clock, which pushed workers to pursue bonuses for punctuality and avoid penalties to their monthly wage, sometimes even for being late by just 1 minute. Tourism, meanwhile, relied on the lure of escapism, on nostalgia, the appeal of being able to take time off work and to be seen to spend money on leisure, as well as on indulging in the image of Korean native culture as curiously backward and sometimes rather barbarian. It was an image that the government general had actively cultivated. Whereas this image of Korea was initially deployed to justify intervention, it also attracted Japanese ethnographers and tourists who found within that a kind of romantic charm, and they weren't unreceptive to its maintenance. Many photo albums produced for Japanese tourists highlighted the slow-moving and disorganized propensity of their colonial subjects, such as in the unpublished 1930 booklet Album of Korean Customs, which features farmers having a nap on the side of a rice field. So either a bong, B-O-N-G, or a bomb went off, but anyway, it's the bizarrely chaotic arrangement of the farmers as they seemingly lie asleep across the narrow path leaves little doubt over the intended purpose of the scene staging, since the ideal tourist experience relied on a mix of exoticism and comfort. Images such as these were regularly juxtaposed with those of very neatly organized shopping streets and modern infrastructure. A series of Japanese postcards from the 1930s called The Everyday Lives of Korean Women showed that even the traditional Kiseng understood well the notion of timeliness and adhered to a strict daily schedule. The postcards comprised photographs of Kiseng posing in romantic outdoor scenes, usually next to each other, because as you do, next to an illustration of a desk clock. And each clock then indicated a different part of the day, just in case you worried that, if you wanted to go and see a Kiseng perform for you, they were very punctual. While school books explained the importance of the new commemorations, and tourists were encouraged to enjoy scenic tours to a quaint past, partly to collect the postmarks of major events and historical landmarks, often historical landmarks that related to previous battles between the Japanese and others, of course, that they won. The Japanese police prohibited many religious and seasonal folk festivals. It is not surprising, therefore, that the new official calendar did not kindle a celebratory spirit amongst the majority of Koreans. Despite their eventual endorsement of the solar calendar, they adhered to it mostly for public or commercial purposes. On the 1st of January, for example, and this is true even today, no major public celebration took place, but the primary official newspaper was filled with large ads from Korean companies sending out New Year's wishes to their clientele. Meanwhile, Koreans continued to observe several lunar calendar-based farming and family-related anniversaries and festivals. Although their opposition to the national calendar was usually silent, the use of the Joseon dynasty's date system on the March 1st Declaration of Independence and the outbreak of the 1929 Gwangju student movement on the 3rd of November, the day on which Emperor Meiji's birthday was celebrated based on the solar calendar, and Korea's National Foundation Day was also quietly celebrated based on the lunar calendar, are signs of continued resistance. Even so, Koreans did not resist the drive towards the improvement of people's time discipline. At the turn of the century, Korean Enlightenment intellectuals had attributed Korean laziness and a lack of punctuality to the absence of universal timekeeping. But by the late 1920s, few Koreans would have disputed the notion that punctuality was a virtue. Although not all Korean people benefited equally from the modern technologies and systems that modernity brought in, they were all affected by the new timekeeping systems to some degree. They tied them to a global time regime and allowed Koreans to measure their productivity and degree of modernization against those of others. The increasingly prevalent use of international time zones and transnational timetables in everyday life not only heightened Koreans' sense of an international connectedness, but also affected the way in which they viewed and organized their public and private activities and engaged and communicated with Japanese and other non-Koreans. To conclude, their adoption was not a simple top-down one-way process, as scholars have suggested. While the popular consensus is that the implementation of the new time management systems in Korea constituted an aspect of the colonial administration that combined commercial and political interests, the experience of punctuality and the adoption of new systems of time management demonstrate that the management of time was, at the very least, ushered in by the demands of increased connectivity and international travel and trade. It was driven by a very complex range of factors that, apart from commerce, colonial politics and evangelism, include exoticism, nostalgia, convenience, and individual ambition.